So I've been running a project for the past year on non-Western influences. And why non-Western? Why is this relevant to a NATO Stratcom COE in Riga? It was based on something we saw quite some time ago, when someone dubbed the Philippines a patient zero of disinformation. Someone alleged that in the Philippines we saw many of these trends that we see today across the world, but far before they happened. And I used to live in East Africa in 2007, 2008. And already then, during the post-election crisis, we saw online engagement in the very infancy of social media that caused havoc in the domestic spaces. So we realized that there's a lot to learn from here. We can identify trends, we can identify methods, and we can identify techniques that will make us, in our sphere of the world, more apt to identifying things that will come, but also to seeing techniques and understanding how to counter specific techniques. So this report is about the Philippines. And I'm going to start off by letting the researchers of this report, Dr. Jonathan Ong, introduce the study to you in 3 minutes before I go in and I dive deeper into these 4 work models of political trolling. I'm going to highlight one thing about this study, which I think is very exciting. And that deals with how they did this study. So this is an ethnographic study. Jonathan Ong managed to get access to the disinformation industry in the Philippines. He interviewed people at every level of disinformation production. So he spoke to the disinformation architects at the top, he spoke to the middlemen, and he spoke to the underpaid trolls working in what he calls the digital underground, the sweatshops of the disinformation industry. And he managed to get them to talk about, why are they doing it? How do they go to bed at night? How do they get all these things? And they came together in 4 models, which I think have relevance for us as well. But first, Jonathan Ong.
Hello, my name is Jonathan Ong. I'm Associate Professor of Communication at the University of Massachusetts. And I'm one of the co-authors of the report Politics and Profit in the Fake News Factory: 4 Work Models of Political Trolling in the Philippines. So the report's main aim is to impart lessons from the Philippines and its fight against digital disinformation for other countries to learn from. So the Philippines, as some of you might know, it's been dubbed by a Facebook executive as the patient zero in the fight against digital disinformation. So the whole premise here is that before you saw the imposter websites, in the context of the Brexit and the Trump elections, we saw it first happen in the Philippines. And there's different factors in which that made fake news as an industry thrive in the Philippines. Duterte is just one part of the story, and the report explains the kind of commercial imperatives and motivations, the different kinds of industries that are complicit and collusive to making fake news so profitable to produce. So it looks at different kinds of work models and work hierarchies of how fake news authors collaborate, work together, agree on contracts, incentivize producers. And what's very unique about this report is that it's drawing from ethnographic research. So we actually interviewed fake news producers. So we tried to understand where do they come from, what their previous jobs were, what their skill sets are, what their aspirations are as digital workers, and ultimately how they also sleep at night. What are their moral justifications for the kind of work that they produce? Are they proud to be fake news producers? And so the report shows you and tells a narrative that apart from the political moment, apart from political ideology, the profitability of fake news is so much embedded in the media and creative industries in the Philippines, such that so many actors are available for hire as consultants for politicians, and we need to hold them into account. We need to think about different kinds of transparency frameworks by which we could hold these different kinds of workers into account. So these workers, they don't need to depend on a black market. They don't need to depend on a dark web to look for clients and seek new projects. They actually only hide in plain sight, and the report explains why.
So you've heard the words patient zero, models, Philippines several times now, and the ethnographic study. So I'm going to talk about the 4 work models that Jonathan introduces, and we'll put some effort into them because I think they're exciting, and I think they also give us tools to understand what we're seeing in our contexts. Because I realize from this research that we've had too much of a simplistic take on the ecosystem of fake news production. So the first model that they introduced is something called the state-sponsored model. It assumes intentionality. There's a person at the top, there's a president, there's a trusted set of advisors around that president, and the president then tweets, speaks, but he does not direct the production himself. Rather, there's a number of enthusiasts, there's a number of people, there's a big keyboard army, hyper-partisan political pundits and so on, that take this message forward. So this is the Philippines. It's not very difficult to imagine this in other political contexts, which you might be more familiar for. Centralized ID production, but that there are a disconnected set of workers that bring the voices out. So this is one way to understand this information, one way to understand how this works. So here it's the masses taking forth the messages of the authority. The second model is an in-house staff model, and that's quite interesting. We've illustrated that with the evil guy with the whip. And that is because it's something that happens inside political campaign offices, where you have old school political veterans that force the political workers to conduct disinformation. And disinformation in this case is running fake accounts, for an example. So you might have the chief of staff of such a political party that runs several fake accounts where they harass critics, where they publish fake news, etc. They then ask other people working in this structure to do the same kind of work. And this happens irrespective of whether or not they like it or not. They're basically ordered to do it. So they take this stick over carrot approach. And we've seen this in other countries as well. We've seen countries where governments order civil servants to do this against their will to carry out political messages. In this specific context, it's something that happens inside political parties. The fourth model is advertising and PR model. This is actually how their ethnographic work studied. This is what they came across first. So this is an hierarchical but loosely networked and ad hoc teams that work as PR companies. So the obvious way is, of course, that political candidates, they go to these ad agencies and they say, I want a campaign. To be successful, they sometimes knowingly and unknowingly use bot networks and disinformation teams to get effect in the environment. What we're seeing, and I think this is quite interesting, is that it's not only political candidates that approach these PR firms. It can be lobbying groups, it can be commercial interests that have a vested interest in a specific candidate winning. So let's say you're a company and you really like your candidate to win. You approach one of these PR companies and you say, well, I want a campaign that's non-attributable, that smears the opposition candidates, and they say, yes, we'll deliver that for you. And what we've seen is that this industry then comes together and it uses chief disinformation architects, anonymous digital influencers, and a vast underground of digital sweatshop workers that are lowly paid. So the high rises here, the digital disinformation architects, they make a lot of money. They're primarily motivated by financial incentives. This is a viable commercial interest that then uses the availability of low-income workers that they expose. So this is also something that's worrying for us because these advertisement and PR companies, they are also available for hire across the world. Philippines is an English-speaking country. If you are in an English-speaking context, you can easily go to these companies and say, well, I'd like to have a disinformation campaign in my country. And they will deliver that for you. And they have the tools, capability, and resources to get that to work. And then the fourth model is the clickbait model. And we saw that during the US presidential election. We know how it looked in Europe. And it is based on ad revenue income. So what we see that these are groups of people, companies, that are motivated by financial incentives. So they are not tied specifically to a single political party or a specific interest group. Instead, they create highly divisive content only to get clicks. And they use this in a very creative environment. We've illustrated this, visualize it as these modern ad agency companies. Open landscape, divided into groups, guys with charts, ad agencies. And they come together and they are creative, and they have one single goal. How do we get people to click our ads so that we get ad revenue? And the answer to that, sadly, is that, well, if you produce sexual content, if you produce racially divisive content, if you produce ethnically divisive content, more people will click it. It will engage emotions, and it will create revenues for these companies. So these are the 4 work models that are seen in the Philippines. It's easy to think of other models in our own context. If we take the context we most often looked at, where we have state actors, well, we see the state actor-led one with state-owned companies as well. But I think all of this comes together to the point to understand that we should not understand this information as something that happens only in a vacuum in a centralized chain of command production. Those models exist. But to combat the problem, we need to take a much larger understanding of the issue. Because, as we've seen, there are several different competing actors in this online disinformation environment. And also, for it to be effective, it requires this collaboration and competition among various workers in very distributed labor arrangements. And worrying for the rest of the world is that there is evidence to suggest that these national industries are set to export their services globally. I'm going to pause a little bit at this globalization of the disinformation industry and give you 2 cases. I recently ran a workshop in Nigeria, and I found in the Nigerian context, I found a website that sold clicks and likes. And I'm going to come back to that because that's my main passion, how to buy clicks and likes. So I, of course, went onto that website and I placed an order, as I do whenever I find one of these sites, to figure out what are the subcontractors that they rely upon. Well, it turns out that this Nigerian company relies upon Russian software, but also Southeast Asian content production. So if you live in Nigeria and you want to buy a disinformation campaign, you're going to end up, to some extent, whether you like it or not, or whether you know it or not, inside this very globalized disinformation industry. We also have, in Nigeria, a case where a political candidate reached out to an Israeli company who then used both Russian software and disinformation labor for hire in Southeast Asia to produce these global campaigns. So 4 recommendations out of this to highlight. One of them is, of course, that we need to talk about this more. Not only from the perspective of social media companies, but also from the need for self-regulation among local advertisers and the PR industry. And I'm going to come back to that because there is a complicitness here. We see that in many of these work models, the people that benefit from it are distributed labor arrangements, individual companies, specific workers. And if we don't understand this, we're not going to be able to solve the problem, so to say. For us to understand this fully, of course, we need to push for legal reforms that surrounds transparency and accountability. In the Philippines, they mentioned updating electoral laws to get more financing. And I think to get more financial transparency. And I think we can see that in almost every country, that it's extremely difficult to understand who is paying for what and getting what effect in the context of campaigns. And if we're not getting transparency in that, it is very difficult to have a democratic conversation around who is trying to influence us. And transparency is one of the very important aspects to get to functioning democracy. Right? One of the things that they brought up from the Philippine context, which I thought was very interesting, was an idea that maybe we need to create inclusive oversight committees, national ones, that can inform social media companies about local standards and concerns. We have very big companies. The most of them are US-based, and we expect them to go into every country of the world and be fully aware of the local context, the disinformation actors in that specific context. It's very difficult for the social media companies. Maybe we need to set up an oversight committee involving all civil society and all actors that can have this conversation with them. And finally, and this is also something that we haven't talked so much about that they bring up, is the conditions for creative workers around the world. And they use the term digital sweatshops, and I think that's very interesting. So we have, in many countries around the world, there is more and more people who are highly educated, but they struggle to find gainful employment. Well, what do you do if you are a computer programmer in Siberia and you can't find a job at Facebook or Twitter? Well, you might think, well, maybe I can manipulate these companies, and you might make a software, and you might offer that for services to the world. In the Philippines, you might have someone who's a creative expert in the ad industry, or who's very good at writing content, or journalists. If you can't find gainful employment, there's always the risk that someone will come and say, well, I'll employ you. I'll give you an income if you do this sort of work. And if you are impoverished, if you don't have any rights, there is, of course, a risk that you are drawn into this industry. So we need to look at both ends here. We need, of course, to disincentivize the people that buy these things. We need to create transparency so that we can disincentivize it from the society's perspective. But in the end, we also need to work with workers' right in the digital domain. And I always go back to that. We talk a lot about, what were the working conditions of the suit that you bought? How much did they make, the people that produced this suit? And that's a very important aspect. But how many of you ever wondered what the people that made your apps were paid, whether or not they were exploited or not? And if we don't get our head around this, we risk opening up doors to actors to exploit these labor arrangements. And that's something to consider. So 4 models for you, 4 models that I hope can start a conversation that will help us understand to a greater extent what we're seeing here locally. So thank you very much for that.